I'm here to welcome you and to hopefully make things smooth so that Professor Rustom is able to share his wonderful presentation. So, the Hidden Treasure Seminar Series is brought to us cooperatively by Monash University and the Ibn Arabi Society Asia Pacific Branch. Their monthly presentations ongoing that explores the contemporary relevance of the medieval sage Ibn Arabi. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Rustom. He is the Professor of Islamic Studies at Carleton University in Canada. Through pursuing a PhD in philosophy, a student of William Chittick, Professor Rustom has focused his research on Sufism, Islamic philosophy and theology, and Quranic exegesis. He is extensively published as a scholar, a prolific and awarded author, active as an editor, including as an assistant editor in the recently published Study Quran, and an internationally regarded speaker. He has a webpage where you can access under his name his extensive body of work and more through his media appearances. And I think given this substantial contribution and body of work that he has achieved in his career, he's really personally and uniquely qualified to explore with us today the presentation that he's bringing to us, an invitation, Ibn Arabi's invitation to self-discovery, a letter to a rationalist. So we will have 40 minutes to listen to Professor Rustom's talk, and we'll record that, as someone was asking before, and then we've allowed 20 minutes for questions and answers. And so allowing this invitation to self-discovery to speak to us as we listen and what questions arise. And so either you can, under the reaction button at the bottom of your screen, raise your hand during that 20 minutes, and that'll pop you into a queue and I'll call on you to share your question, or you can type it into the chat and I'll read it aloud. Now, obviously 20 minutes is not too long for questions and answers, but sometimes the questions still, we need to ponder them, even if there's no time to find a complete resolution. Okay, so I warmly invite us to open our hearts and engage and really enjoy this time. And it's really a great pleasure, Professor Rustom, to invite you to begin. And we're looking forward to what you're going to share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, first of all, I wanted to, thank Aydoğan for his very generous invitation to come speak here. This is the first time I'm meeting him, actually, even though I feel like I've known him for my whole life. So thanks to Aydoğan, the Ibn Arabi Initiative at Monash University. This is an incredible thing, a really amazing endeavor. And I think that, and I really hope and pray that this thing takes off, as it already has. In the midst of a pandemic, we still are seeing continuous lectures and reading groups. And hopefully when this trial leaves the world, we'll have many more opportunities to meet in person and to continue doing this work together, which is so important for our times. So thank you, Aydoğan. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and for all of you for coming, for spending, I guess this would be your Saturday morning here with us. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to do two things first. The first thing is I'm not going to go through the letter with you, this letter that we're speaking about. And the reason is because we've shared the link with you. And so really what my talk will be is it'll be more or less something like an introduction to this letter. And what is this letter? I'm going to leave it very mysterious to you. Who's this rationalist? We're going to keep it all kind of in suspense. Eventually, I'm going to start letting the secret out of the bag. Don't click the link that Aydoğan has sent you. Otherwise, you'll know the name of this rationalist. But I guess what I should do first is I'm going to begin with a couple of anecdotes. Because, what's a Sufi discourse without some stories? So the first one goes like this. There was once a rationalist and let's put him in the 13th century. Put him in the 1200s. Let's give him a date too. Let's say 1202. Central Asia, Transoxania. He enters into the lodge of a Sufi master, and he says to the Sufi master, "I'm this decorated scholar, well known, man of intelligence, man of letters, very popular debater, public figure, and really one of the superstars of the Islamic world at that time." And he says, "I have a spiritual quest. I'm seeking God. You're the Sufi master, so you please do with me as you see fit." And the master, without hesitation, says to him, "All right, you come with me." Takes him by the hand, puts him in a khalwa cell, where you go into a kind of retreat, a retreat cell where you carry out certain invocatory formulas, and it's meant to really kind of, break your soul, and other things are supposed to happen. So he says, "Yes, I'm totally ready for this. Take me into it." And the master takes him in. He gives him some invocations, some formulae to recite. And this rationalist starts reciting them. After a while, as is normally the custom in these kinds of settings, the master enters back into the khalwa cell, into the retreat cell, and starts monitoring the progress of this would-be aspirant. And he sees that he's doing very well. He has a very strong soul. But he finds, because he's a Sufi master, he can see these things. He finds that there's a certain thing that's holding this person back. And what's holding him back, of course, is his book learning. He's very learned. He's got a lot of books, and he's read them all. And he's written a lot of books too. And so this master, with his powers of himma and what's called tasarruf in Arabic, this kind of control that he has over the souls of people, he starts extracting the book knowledge of this person slowly. And he feels it as he's in the meditation. He feels that something's happening to him. And then he discerns what's happening, which is that his book knowledge is being taken away from him. He can't handle it. So he doubles up, stands up, and walks out. Now, that's an interesting story. And there are historical, issues with whether this event did happen or not with the particular person, this rationalist of ours, who will be the object of our discussion today. But let me tell you another story about the same person. It is said that he used to have 30 proofs for the existence of God. 30 proofs. And anyone who's read his writings would recognize that this is not a second-rate thinker at all. When he has a proof, it's a serious proof. And he had 30 of them. So he's walking with his entourage one day, and they passed through the town. Like I said, in the olden days, the religious scholars and philosophers were celebrities. And so everyone starts coming out of the village quarters. They all start greeting him, kissing his hand, and standing up for him, of course, out of a sign of respect. And there's one old lady sitting there, and she doesn't get up. So the entourage pass right past her, and she looks at him and just kind of not amused, continues with whatever she's doing. And one of this man's students says, "Hey, do you know that's so-and-so? He has 30 proofs for the existence of God. You should stand up for him." And she replies, she says, "Well, the only reason he has 30 proofs is because he has 30 doubts." So the man in question is none other than the great philosopher, theologian, Quranic exegete, scholar extraordinaire, Fakhruddin al-Razi. Fakhruddin al-Razi. Sometimes I'll refer to him more naturally in the Persian way. They call him Fakhr Razi in Persian. Sometimes in a pejorative way, Fakhr Razi. So this man, Fakhruddin al-Razi, was a contemporary of Maimonides. He died in the year 1210 of the Common Era. He, if you were to rank the greatest thinkers in Islamic civilization, he'd be up there in the top 5 for sure, I think, by anybody's estimate. He has the most extensive Quran commentary ever written by a single individual, and it's by far the deepest and most profound commentary upon the Quran that you'll ever read, written by one person. It's an amazing commentary. I mean, the level of detail he can get into, the innovations that he introduces into Quranic commentary literature, how he makes philosophy become a natural part of theological and exegetical reasoning in Islam. It's second to none. And this man, however, for as great as he was, had developed a reputation, Fakhruddin Razi did, in his own lifetime, for being something like, not just a rationalist, but somebody who relied on his reason a little bit too much. And so there are a lot of these stories that get passed around, especially in 13th century Persianate culture, in Ottoman context later on, which seek to set Fakhruddin Razi up as a kind of, arch intellectual, somebody who represents a certain way of thinking, which is good, but also can lead to a kind of unhealthy status vis-a-vis your soul if it's taken too far. So there's all kinds of interesting jokes about Razi in the literature, these aforementioned anecdotes. Rumi, no one less than Rumi himself, weighs in on Fakhruddin Razi, and in his verses, he sometimes criticizes Razi. And my favorite one is where he says, and darin bas ar khirad rah din budi, Fakhre Razi razdan din budi. That if in this discussion of ours, in the quest for God, if the intellect, khirad, intellect, can discern the way, if the intellect could figure it all out, then this man, Fakhruddin Razi, he'd be the mystery keeper of religion. So this is kind of, this is the standard topos, the Razi topos in the literature. You find it everywhere. Razi is great, but he's got a slight problem. And so Ibn Arabi, when he shows up to the Muslim East and he stays in what's today Anatolia for a couple of years, he probably hears about the image of Razi, or when he was in Egypt, probably too. And so there's a big historical kind of background to how he found out about who Razi was. And he certainly read his writings. He tells us that himself. And he also had a common friend who was a student of Razi. So the individual that connects the two of them is this one individual. We don't know his name. Ibn Arabi refers to him. And this man gives some reports to him about Razi's latest happenings. This is before Facebook and Twitter and all these things. Right? So, but when an international star like Razi did something, everybody knew about it. Whenever he'd go up on the pulpit and he'd preach, everybody would know about it. Here's another interesting story about Razi. One time he was on the pulpit preaching, and he had a major, he had a lot of polemical debates with different theological groups, Ismailis, 12er Shiites, Mutazilites, so on and so forth. And he used to preach from the Friday pulpit, and he'd say things like, this group, they have no proof. They have no proof. Remember, Razi loves proof. It's all about proofs for him. And one day he's going home, and one of these theological opponents grabs him from the side in an alley and puts a knife to his back and says, look, you better stop, saying bad things about us. Otherwise, next time I'm going to do away with you. So the next Friday, Razi's on the pulpit, and he no longer speaks about the fact that this group has no more proofs. And his students said to him, why do you always say these people have no proof? They have no proof, but now you're not saying anything. And he said, well, because I've seen their proof. I've seen what their proof's all about. So this is the kind of person Razi was. He was a very, kind of fiery personality, and he didn't suffer fools. So it wasn't so easy to approach him and to try to correct him. Who would dare do that? His own student wouldn't even try when Razi falls into a kind of intellectual predicament. But Ibn Arabi is Ibn Arabi, and he finds out all kinds of things about all kinds of people. So he ends up finding out about this person named Razi, and he says, this is an interesting person. Let me read some of his books. So he starts reading his books, and he says, these are good. These are really good books. So he decides to write Razi a letter, because he says, your intellectual capacity is very strong. You've got a very powerful imaginative faculty. In Arabic. You've got a very strong imaginative faculty and the ability to reason very well. He says, but however, you have a problem. And the problem is that you rely too much on yourself. Not just on your own intelligence, but on your own self. And once the focus shifts from reliance on God to reliance on the self, then that becomes a huge problem when it comes to the question of walking the spiritual path. So the crisis that Ibn Arabi recalls in this letter to Razi is he says that one of your own friends, your own disciples, tells me that one day you were sitting down And it's basically what he describes as kind of like a nervous breakdown almost, where Razi's sitting there and he all of a sudden starts crying, weeping. And his disciple says to him, "Why are you crying?" He goes, "Because, there's a proof that I discovered 30 years ago. And today I've come to realize that it's not correct." And he goes, "If I had that proof that I realized after 30 years that's not correct, I wonder about the rest of my knowledge. How many other gaps are in my thinking? How many other holes are in these so-called watertight proofs that I have?" And so Ibn Arabi recounts this story to him. And it matches up very well, incidentally, with the historical record, because we know from Razi's own autobiographical writings and other passages in his works that he, in fact, did go through some kind of intellectual, spiritual crisis. And he wasn't a man who wasn't given to spirituality. That's the one thing that we need to understand when it comes to these authors in Islamic civilization. Very few of them were like the kinds of rationalists that we would be, accustomed to seeing today, for example. So when we use the word rationalist, even with respect to someone like Razi, this is not somebody who does not believe in God. He believes in God. He is not somebody who, he's not skeptical about the afterlife, for example. He lives his entire life for the afterlife. He's a man, if you read his writings, there's a deep piety in his writings and a very strong spiritual pull. And he's also very intelligent. In one of the chapters in his Quran commentary, the very end of the 10th surah, 10th chapter of the Quran, he's commenting and he says that, "I'm finishing this commentary and I'm very sad today because my son died." And we know that one of his children died when his child was young. There was some kind of plague going around and the child died. Omar was his name. And Razi says, "I'm very sad. Of course, I'm brokenhearted completely, but I decided that I have to finish this text. Anybody who reads this commentary, if you do so, please pray for my son." Now, this is Razi. He knows that everyone's going to be reading that commentary, right? It's the most widely read Quran commentary, at least amongst intellectuals and spiritually inclined people from the 13th century till the present day. So he's a very smart guy. And so he's not, when I say rationalist, I don't mean to, lump him with, let's say, I don't know, 18th century rationalists or something like this, or, these people who pass themselves as scientists, scientific kind of rationalists today, like Dawkins and people like that. Razi is not like that at all. He's a man of deep, deep faith. But Ibn Arabi says that's not good enough. Remember, Ibn Arabi's standards are even higher than everybody else's, right? He's like, that's just not good enough. If you want to walk the way, if you want to become a self-realized person, you have to give up the things that are most dear to you. Book knowledge, holding on, grasping to the things that are the fruits of your own intellectual efforts and achievements. Ibn Arabi says that's your problem. That's not everybody's problem. All of us have certain spiritual things that hold us back. For some, it's not intellectual problems at all. It's other things. Maybe it's a habit. Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's a kind of quality of soul. But Razi's issue, it's basically this problem of just self-reliance. And so Ibn Arabi cuts to the chase in this letter, and he says, what you need to do is you have to begin to aspire towards God on God's terms, not on your terms. And now some of you are probably inclined to think, yeah, but so are you supposed to give up your intelligence? Because this is often what happens, especially when I speak to some of my students. Sometimes they try to object right away, and they say, oh, but you were just talking about all the intellectual stuff, and then now you're telling us that we don't need our intelligence. No, it's not that you don't need your intelligence. The intelligence is a very important thing that you have, and it's a God-given gift that you're supposed to use. You're not supposed to denigrate it at all. Rumi, again, in one of his verses, he says that pay istidlaliyan chubin bovad, pay chubin sakh bi tamkin bovad, that the leg of the philosophers is wood. It's a wooden leg. Pay chubin sakh bi tamkin bovad, and the wooden leg is awfully unsturdy. See, he's not saying that the philosophers istidlaliyan do not have a leg to stand on. Rumi would say that about many contemporary thinkers. He's not saying that about the classical Islamic philosophers. He said they do have a leg to stand on, and it's helpful for them, but it's not enough to make you fly up to the heavenly empyrean. That's something else. To do that, you have to become angelic in your soul, and you have to be willing to let go. So the intelligence that Ibn Arabi is telling him to let go of, he's not saying become irrational or irrational. He's just telling him you have to be able to place your reliance upon God and not upon your own discursive powers. And one point that he makes in the letter is he says that the discursive power of the individual, it's called fikr in Arabic, fikr, Fikr. It's very important, but it always kind of puts a person in a subject-object kind of duality vis-a-vis themselves and God and their object of knowing. It's discursive. You're always going from concept to concept. And so once you're implicated in that kind of a dialogical process, you don't lose yourself completely in it. There's your object of knowledge, and you seek to know it. So he tells him there's a big difference, however, between knowing the existence of God and knowing God. You can know the existence of God. You can demonstrate that intellectually, but knowing God is something very different. Anyone who's ever been in love can tell you that, having a theoretical knowledge of love and the actual business of love are two very different things. And, often when we talk about the spiritual quest, the love relationship, it's the greatest kind of window into what these authors are getting at. Because love never lies. Ibn Arabi says, look, you have all these formulae for understanding God. How's that going to work in a love relationship? What are you going to tell your beloved? I love you by this much emotions, and quantify, 19 grams of love, 82 grams of emotion and affection. Like, it doesn't work that way. You can't quantify love, right? If you say it, then you have to be able to show it, right? But speaking about it's not good enough. You have to actually become it. Otherwise, the beloved will know very quickly that you're just making claims, and then of course they're not gonna take too well to that. There's a saying in Persian that says, "Tasawwuf yaftan as nabaftan." Sufism, or the spiritual path, it's finding, not mental weaving. Weaving between concepts and jumping from here to there. So how does a person, therefore, take on don the garb of the humility to the extent that they can recognize their own shortcomings? We have to figure out what they are vis-a-vis ourselves, because we don't have Ibn Arabi telling us what our problems are. Razi's lucky that Ibn Arabi wrote him this letter. We don't know, by the way, historically, whether Razi received the letter or not. The paper trail, in the Middle East and in the pre-modern cultures, it's not that great. It's very difficult to find out, unless if a reference shows up in some text. It's very difficult. Ibn Arabi actually tells us in the Futuhat that he wrote 2 letters to Razi. So that other letter, we have no knowledge of it, and it hasn't survived at all. But judging from some of Razi's later writings, it might have been the case that he did, in fact, chance upon this letter, that it reached him, that is to say. We don't know. But what we do know is that whereas Ibn Arabi is writing this letter to Fakhruddin Razi, because he's Ibn Arabi and all of his concerns are so universal, you can rest assured that when he refers to it in his writings, as he often does in the Futuhat several times, he also wants us to be alerted to the fact that there is a Razi inside all of us. So it's not just a letter to a particular rationalist in pre-modern Islamic civilization. That letter of his, it pertains to all of us. And the reason is because even if we don't have rationalism as a problem or our book learning as a problem, we have other problems. And the solution Ibn Arabi gives it's like a one-size-fits-all solution. He says we all aspire to something. As human beings, we all want something. We all move towards something. And by virtue of the fact that we have aspiration, we need to understand that some aspirations fall short of the goal and others are more meaningful than others. If we aspire to, let's say, have knowledge of worldly things, that's good. But what's the use of that kind of aspiration? It's good for worldly ends. That's why Ghazali for example, calls the Islamic scholars, the fuqaha, the legal jurists, he calls them scholars of this world. They're not scholars in terms, insofar as they are legal scholars. They're not scholars of the afterlife. That's another science that you need to cultivate, whether you're a jurist or not. So with someone like Razi, Ibn Arabi in the letter says, look, everybody aspires to things, but how will those things help you when you die? So he gives this beautiful example. He says, if you have knowledge of medicine, that knowledge of medicine will help you in this world, cure bodies, cure your own body, so on and so forth. When you die, it's not going to be of any use to you. Same with mathematics, same with any other science, engineering, you name it. So in my favorite passage in the letter, he says to him that human beings, when they die, they return to God completely empty-handed, sadija. They have nothing left to hold on to. The only thing that matters at that moment when they meet God is the extent to which they remembered him in this life, how close they were to God, if they cultivated the spiritual life, if they were able to transcend themselves, if they were able to direct themselves in the true, in terms of the true and proper aspect of their aspiration. Were they able to do that completely? Then the Sufis say that God gives himself to an individual entirely if they give themselves to him entirely. You have to give yourself to God. So Ibn Arabi is telling Razi, look, you need to just give up. Stop being this hot shot, intellectual. Stop letting your problems for the rest of us hold you back, whatever they may be. Come empty-handed. Like Rumi says, I love quoting Rumi because he always has the right things to say and they always come at the right moments. You know how his poetry is. He says, that of all of the forms of learning that you can have on the day of your death, the only one that will matter and provide provisions for the way is the science of poverty. Danish faqr. Now, what is the science of poverty? That's the science of Sufism. Letting go completely, letting God sail the boat for you, literally just resigning. As the Quran says, "Ufawwidu amri ilallah," entrust my affair to God. So the more you entrust your affair to God, Ibn Arabi is telling Razi in the letter, the less will you rely upon yourself, and the less frustrated you'll be when you discover that your knowledge fell short of the goal. That's why Razi goes and cries, because that's 30 years of serious scholarship just to find out that he's wrong. Yeah, I'd probably cry too, right? I mean, like that's not something to be proud of. He's honest enough to feel like this is terrible, right? But in Ibn Arabi's, he tells him at the beginning of the letter, he says that there's a prophetic tradition. Just to give you an idea of the intentions that inform the writing of the letter, it's not to one-up a person. Ibn Arabi doesn't need to one-up anybody. And that's not obviously the way these people operate. He says there's a prophetic tradition that says if you love your brother, you should tell him. And he begins the letter, he quotes that tradition, then he tells Razi, and I love you. So it comes out of a universal love for the welfare of this person who he hears about, who's in such a difficult situation. Now, if that's the situation of Razi in the 1300s, then imagine our own situation today, right? Where our certainties are a lot less great than someone like Razi, despite the fact that he had all of these doubts, right? For us to hold on to our own selves and our own accomplishments, that's kind of the name of the day. That's the name of the game. That's what we're always told as children, right? You're special, right? You can do anything you want in the world. And these are all platitudes that we hear about. They're not entirely true. And sometimes I tell that to my students. I say to them, look, I don't know if you're special or not. That's not for me to judge. But I can tell you that the Sufis would say that you're not special if you haven't lived up to the reality of the human state, which is to become no thing. So to recognize your poverty and to aspire towards nothingness, that's the best possible thing that a person can do, Ibn Arabi tells Razi. And he says that you will be able to do that the minute you recognize the complete dependence that you have upon God for everything. There's a famous prophetic tradition where he tells us that you should pray to God that when you put on one shoe or a sandal, you should pray to God to give you the power to put on the next sandal. Now, most of us wouldn't even think twice about, you just throw your shoes on, right? But look at the level of reliance that's being spoken about in this tradition. You're supposed to hold on to God at every moment, recognize your complete nothingness before God. And by understanding that you're nothing in this way, you're not losing anything. You're actually gaining everything. Right? The science of poverty, the need to aspire towards the divine, the attempt to walk that way, not on your own terms, but on God's terms, are really the terms that Ibn Arabi sets out here for Razi. And so it also relates to us. One of my most favorite passages also in this letter is one where he tells Razi, he says, I would love to give you the instruction to enter into the spiritual retreat. I'd love to tell you how to do this. So it's at the very end of the letter. He goes, but I can't do it because the evil scholars are preventing me. Now, what he's referring to, the ulama as-su, you can only guess. One guess, in terms of, to satisfy historians, is that he wrote this letter to Razi probably in Egypt, where Ibn Arabi ran into a little bit of trouble with some of the people, some of the local scholars there because of a poem that he wrote, and his commentary didn't really help the situation, but Ibn Arabi had to eventually leave Egypt. So that's one possibility. But another way to understand that is he's telling Razi, I would love to lay out for you these criteria for the spiritual path, but the evil scholars, that is the that part of you that should be acquiescing to this is not ready just yet. So I'm being prevented by nothing other than the very state of the recipient, which is why when we read these texts, we feel like we're either repelled by them or we're pulled towards them. There's no two ways about it, especially reading someone like Ibn Arabi. Either you fall in love or you're just utterly like what is this? And one time someone said, I'm reading all these things and I'm just not seeing it. I'm just not seeing it. Well, in order to see it, you have to understand a few things. Number one, are you able to see? When you say, I'm just not seeing it, could you be blind? Is that a possibility? Because we're too quick to give ourselves the benefit of the doubt, right? But if we recognize our ignorance and our kind of absolute nothingness, and the very fact that we depend upon God for every single thing, then that can only engender a kind of state of humility and need before God. Ibn Atta'illah, the famous Sufi master, in one of his aphorisms, he says, this is a kind of idiomatic English translation I'll give you. He says something like, there is nothing sounds better to God than that of need knocking at the door, and nothing is more beloved to him than being lowly and poor. Right? So you come to God with the tongue of need, not with the tongue of demands. Right? How many people have ever fallen in love? When we fall in love, there's a kind of humility towards your object of love, especially if you've worked hard to attain your object of love. Right? You don't come with demands. God doesn't want a person coming with demands. God makes the demands, that's true. But a human being, they need to kind of more or less just step back, let God do the guiding. What do we lose if we let go of the things that we hold dear to ourselves? You lose nothing. Ibn Atta'illah, in that famous, another one, he says, he goes, those who have lost you, what have they found? And those who have found you, what have they lost? You lose nothing. You lose nothing if you walk the spiritual path. And that's what Ibn Arabi is telling Razi towards the end of the letter. He says, you owe it to yourself to do this. You, such a smart person who can discern falsehood from truth, who used this intelligence to discover the truth, now come and taste that truth. There's a very big difference between having a propositional knowledge of something and tasting it. This goes back to Ghazali's famous example of dhawq, which Ain al-Quzat, an author that I've been working on for some time, he has a lot to say about that tasting. Right? If you talk about apples and strawberries and honey, you can distinguish kind of through intellectual discourse how they're sweet and how they're different, but you can't ever really communicate that to anybody. And you yourself have a very hard time kind of situating what it is that distinguishes them in terms of their levels of sweetness. So kind of like a strawberry, honey, it's got a similar sweetness, a little bitter, like how that's not, you're not going to be able to really get to the heart of it. The only way to do it is to taste it. And you can't describe that to somebody. You have to give it to them. That's a kind of affective knowledge. Now, there's still this lingering problem about, so what about the role of the intellect, my intelligence and all of this? I don't want to lose the things that I have. And that goes back to that anecdote with Razi at the beginning, where he's sitting there and the master tries to pull out the knowledge from him, and Razi's like, nah, I just can't do it. I don't want to let go. I'm not prepared. See, when you die, you have to give up your whole self, not just a part of what you have, your status, your followers on Facebook, or how many people, I don't know what, I don't know, I'm not on this stuff, but I guess with Twitter, there's followers too, right? So yeah, that's all gonna go. Then, and you're gonna go back empty-handed. You're gonna come back in your complete abject state before God. And so, because we're going to be reduced to that state anyway, why not come now like that? Ibn Arabi is saying, why not come now? What do you have to lose? You have nothing to lose. This is not like out of Pascal's wager where, maybe it'll be good for you if you find out later. And if there's nothing after you die, then, well, you lost nothing. No, Ibn Arabi he's seeing into that world, and he's saying, look, you have absolutely nothing to lose. And in an interesting passage in the letter, he tells Razi, what you need to do is you need to cultivate the science of the afterlife in such a way that you feel as comfortable with walking there, with the molten of the afterlife, the homestead of the afterlife, as you do in your own home. So every nook and cranny in your own home is you're kind of relaxed. You don't feel stress and pressure, and you're in your element, as they say. Ibn Arabi says that's the way you should be with the afterlife, much, much more so than in this world. This world's not it's gonna turn its back on you anyway. And even if it doesn't, you're gonna leave it before it leaves you. One way or the other, we're all going towards that goal. So why not hold on to the things of God? Why not seek the things of God? Ibn Arabi also, in the letter to Razi, wants to drive home the point that we as human beings become very proud of our accomplishments, and it becomes very difficult for us to acknowledge that there are flaws in us that hold us back from spiritual progress. You find so many people like this. They're like, I want to do this. I want to walk the spiritual life. I want to do these things, but I'm just not ready yet. Or I need another year. I need 2 more years. I remember a friend of mine, he was studying logic and theology and in law, and I said to him, when are you going to walk the spiritual path? You're studying all this fiqh and mantiq and all these sciences. What if you die studying this stuff? And he said, I'm just not ready. I'm not ready. Well, who's to say that after you've cultivated all this knowledge that you'll be ready? You might be more proud, actually, and much more harder for you to, right? What holds a person back, like Ghazali says in his book on pride, he says ultimately what holds them back is their own self-reliance. It's because precisely they rely upon themselves. And the goal of Sufism, it's to let go of yourself. That's faqr, to let God be the one who's in charge. And to not be so beholden by this, what they call the monkey mind, right? Always jumping from concept to concept, never being fully satisfied. That's pretty much, as I see it, the entire history, especially of modern thought. It's people creating holes for themselves, or rings or loops for themselves to jump through when there are no problems to begin with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with a quote that goes back to a follower of Ibn Arabi, another Persian poem, if I can remember it. It goes with the Mahmud Shibistari, and it's really the most important verse that I've ever seen, which speaks about this problem. And then hopefully we can open up the floor to some discussion, because I'm right at the 40-minute mark. He says, Zahinadan ke khurshid taban be nur sham juyad dar biyaban. He goes, how many fools are there who go around looking for the sun in the middle of the deserts on a bright sunny day with a candle in their hand. So I thank you all very much. And now we have time to discuss a little bit. Hopefully this whets your appetite and gives you a chance to read the letter, and we can move on further after that, inshallah.